So near the end of July, I gave a talk titled One Dharma about how Buddhism had spread in the world from its beginnings in Northeast India, approximately 2,500 years ago. Early Buddhism, taught by the Buddha after his enlightenment, was memorized by monks until the talks could be written, literally on leaves, on palm leaves, and compiled over time into a collection, the Pali Canon. We at IMCC work with this early Buddhism called Theravada or Vipassana insight, and heavily reference the suttas in the Pali Canon, or talks or scriptures, whatever you want to call them. It's interesting, some teachers have memorized books of the Pali Canon and can cite chapter and verse, like some people do in the Bible. So I have one teacher, Lee Brasington, who does that. So I might say to Lee, gee, I've been looking for that story about Angulimala. Where would I find that? And he'd say, oh, in the Majjhima Nikaya, number such and such, verse such and such. It's simply amazing. Also, when people are studying to be teachers, we study the suttas. I was in a sutta study group. It's good to do it in a group because it takes a bit to decipher them, and it's helpful to have a lot of heads on it. So I was in a sutta study group for 7 years. There were probably 8 or 9 of us in that group, and we ended over a disagreement. But that was a long run, 7 years. We covered a lot of ground. So it's helpful to think of the Buddha's teachings as being the trunk of a great tree, with Theravada Mahayana and Vajrayana being the 3 main branches, or the 3 turnings of the wheel, where different aspects of the original teaching got emphasized. Now, approximate dates for these turnings are Vipassana, 500 BCE, Mahayana, 100 BCE, and most recently, Vajrayana in 300 CE. So we've come into the Common Era. As Buddhism became more of a popular movement in the second turning, the Pali Canon wasn't repudiated, but was expanded in favor of living Buddhist masters who were sometimes considered more relevant. Buddhism blended with every other culture and spiritual tradition it encountered. And with most everything that changes, many things were gained and some set aside and lost. I found an example of words from the trunk of the tree on the transient nature of life. This is from the Pali Canon, from the Samyutta Nikaya. Form is like a glob of foam, feeling a bubble. Perception, a mirage. Fabrication, a banana tree. Consciousness, a magic trick. This has been taught by the kinsmen of the sun. However you observe them, appropriately examine them. They're empty, void to whoever sees them appropriately. And then these got echoed centuries later, even more poetically, in the famous Mahayana Zen Diamond Sutra. So you should see all of the fleeting world, a star at dawn, a bubble in the stream, a flash of lightning in a summer cloud, a flickering lamp, phantom, and a dream. Different and not. Just as all the ironies in Buddhism, things are not as they seem, nor are they different. What we're looking for here is not that one branch of Buddhism is better than another. Competition and othering doesn't get us anywhere. These branches all developed slightly differently, organically and intricately. All contain skillful means. We can look to them as ways of evoking new ways of perceiving, which can help us let go of suffering. For myself, I found personally that many of the devotional aspects of Theravadan, as well as body awareness practices, dropped as it became Americanized. So I'm so thrilled to hear it picked up again in devotional aspects like chanting. Your chanting was wonderful, Sandy, and Lama Tashi's will go straight to your bones. In a way, Joseph Goldstein teaches, there are 4 basic principles or understandings. At the heart of understanding there's one Dharma. The first is that all these concepts are descriptions of experience and not the experience itself. There's a great illustration in Zen of that, where there's a monk pointing at the moon. And the point of it is not the monk pointing at the moon. The point of it is your own experience with the moon. And that's what I invite you to do with next week with Lama Tashi's chanting. To have, it's incredible to be in the same room with someone who chants like that. And to really be aware of your experience with that. The second, that mindfulness, compassion, and wisdom weave together as the essential strands of a non-sectarian path of practice. And the third is that there's both the relative and the ultimate perspectives of reality. And together they provide a framework for holding divergent points of view. And lastly, the mind of non-grasping is the essential unifying experience of freedom. Non-grasping is the essential unifying experience of freedom. So the temple bells of Theravada, the wooden clapper of Zen, and the long horns of Vajrayana, all can awaken us to ultimate freedom.
Going to take a little bit of, I think, pulling through the notes I've put together. I think I mentioned earlier, I just first wanted to mention some of the commonalities. And the common to all the traditions of Buddhism is the taking refuge in the three jewels, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And just to share that, Buddha, it's the physical Buddha, and it's really the work he did that we're taking refuge in. It's his example, and it's the same capacity that we all have. So ultimately, we're taking refuge in the Buddha within ourselves as well. And the Dharma is the teachings of the Buddha, which is a vast canon, as Jeanne mentioned, about the Pali Canon, and we have Mahayana Sutras, and then we have Vajrayana teachings also that we can take refuge in if we choose. And just to share that Sangha is often understood as the immediate community, which there's no question. We can't do this path without the help of each other. But the ultimate meaning of Sangha that you're taking refuge in is in those beings who have achieved liberation. And that's common throughout Buddhism, that there is the capacity for liberation, which is the ability to go beyond the process of cause and effect, to go beyond karma, to go beyond the afflicted mind. And that's ultimately what you're taking refuge in, is that capacity and the teachings of how to practice that capacity, and then the fact that it actually does exist. I think for me in my life, some of the most precious opportunities has been being able to be with great practitioners, like being able to be with His Holiness Dalai Lama and Cancer Yeshe Thupten, who was our first teacher, who was like a saint. My main teacher, Geshe Jambal Tardo, Lama Tashi, his teacher, the 100th Ganden Tripa. It's through being with some of these amazing practitioners that you start to get a glimpse of what the mind is capable of. And not just the mind, but one's entire being. And so that's ultimately what you're taking refuge in, that capacity. And I just wanted to mention Vajrayana Buddhism, that Lama Tashi, is a Vajrayana practitioner. The basis of Vajrayana practice is Mahayana. And the main distinction between Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana, there's so much in common. So first I'll mention more of the commonalities. There's taking refuge in the three jewels. It's the belief in liberation. And it's the belief that the Eightfold Path is the way that one gets there. It's the belief in karma, the law of cause and effect, that things don't occur just out of nowhere, that everything that occurs is due to previous causes. And therefore, one has great potential to impact one's life. And granted, there's some limitations dependent upon the habituation that's been in effect from previous lives in this life, but nonetheless, there is always, always, always capacity to adjust and to go in a more positive direction. So that's what's common throughout. It's the commonality of the Four Noble Truths, that it's through the mind that fails to understand the nature of things as they are, that is why we experience suffering in life. And that was the first noble truth that the Buddha came to realize. And I always think it's so beautiful in Buddhism, it's so empirical, that it was Shakyamuni Buddha's seeing someone who was sick and seeing someone who was dying, that it was these realities that propelled him and motivated him, that it was through just looking at life as it is, that there's aging, that there's sickness, that there's death, there's loss, and that these things are not easy in life. And he was willing to just say it like it is. And to me, that's what drew me to Buddhism, that even there was much I valued from my Christian upbringing, but they never named things so clearly as it was named in Buddhism. And to me, that's just beautiful, and it's very, psychological to just look at what is. And that really is the basis of our practice, is looking at what is and then making decisions based on that. And so, in addition to Shakyamuni Buddha seeing the four sights, someone that was ill, someone that was aging, someone that was dying, then the fourth one was he saw a spiritual practitioner. And so those were the four sights that motivated him to leave the palace and pursue a path of freedom. Okay. So much in common through all the branches. That's really, really important. Now, the one distinction that goes into the Mahayana Buddhism that's part of Vajrayana, which Tibetan Buddhism is part of, is the Bodhisattva ideal. So traditionally in Theravadan Buddhism, it's liberation for oneself. Now, in reality of what's happened in the United States is that there's been a lot of cross-fertilization through conferences and discussions. So you do have quite a bit of compassion practices that have moved over into the Theravadan and Vipassana traditions. But it just wasn't emphasized quite the same way. So in Mahayana Buddhism is where the Bodhisattva ideal was developed. And so you have a lot of this all the way through China, in addition to Tibet, of Mahayana Buddhism, and through many other countries. And Zen is one of those Mahayana traditions from Japan, but you have Mahayana Buddhism in China and Tibet and other countries as well. And the seed of a bodhisattva is what's called generating bodhicitta. So this is one thing that's unique to Mahayana Buddhism. And what is bodhicitta? Bodhicitta is basically an extension from the Four Noble Truths. So like I mentioned in the meditation about how just as ourselves, we want happiness and don't want suffering. Bodhicitta is when you're looking at how every other living being and looking at their suffering and seeing how they're under the same problems as oneself, being subject to sickness, aging, death, just all the difficulties of life, and you feel so sad, basically, that people have to suffer, that you have this determination that not only do you yourself want to find liberation, but that you want to help every other living being also. And not only every human, but every animal as well, and other beings in other realms that are talked about. So it's basically it's this heart where you're looking and your eyes are wide open and you're not hiding, you're just seeing things as they are. And it's that kind of feeling in the heart that we're talking about with the Bodhisattva ideal. And so, so such a tall order. So, so just as there's vows throughout all the forms of Buddhism, in the Hinayana Theravada tradition, you have vows. You also do in Mahayana and Vajrayana, and so they're just different levels of vows. A lot of the vows are similar with the basics of not killing, not lying, not stealing, not causing sexual misconduct that harms others, things like this. So those are common to all, and one chooses whether they want to take those vows. And there's the traditional lay vows, and then there's very, very extensive monastic vows that are, and for nuns as well, that are much greater numbers. But then you also have Mahayana vows of where you make vows to never give up on any sentient being, no matter how awful they are. So you have these vows also, and then there's Vajrayana vows that are very, very strict. And of course, a lot of these vows are almost impossible to keep, so you have a lot of purification ceremonies that go along with it as well. Let's see. Well, I want to come back to that throughout Buddhism, all the schools share, you have to say how important intention is, because really it was intention that motivated the Buddha's awakening. And it's through having the intention to develop or allow to come to be one's Buddha capacity that that one grows and progresses along the path. Let's see. So just to mention briefly the three turnings that Jeanne mentioned and Matt had spoken about a while back, that the first turning was the Theravada teachings, going through the Four Noble Truths and Eightfold Path, and emphasis on morality, karma. And in the second turning of the will of Dharma by the Buddha was the Mahayana teachings. And many people have heard of the Heart Sutra, since it's so beautiful. And this is where emptiness is emphasized. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. And so basically the second turning is that all phenomena of cyclic existence are empty of inherent existence. Now this is something that my teacher Geshe Tardo would teach us week after week after week after week after week after week after week. And it's really good because it's analytical meditation basically. So you learn to just start to analyze how you experience reality. And they have just a lot of brilliant methods in Tibetan Buddhism for doing that, of coming to see how we've come to live under conceptualization rather than direct experience, like Jeanne was mentioning, of point to the moon versus the experience. And this is one of our main problems, that we're lost in our concepts and we can't be present. And part of moving along the Bodhisattva path and then becoming a Buddha is they're present. And you can feel this when you meet great beings, that they really are present. But this is what it's related to. It's starting to understand what's meant by phenomena being empty of inherent existence. Now, in the Theravada tradition, you also have the concept of emptiness, but it's in relation to the emptiness of oneself. And in Mahayana, it extends over. So with Hinayana, it does apply to the 5 skandhas of the emptiness, but it's of oneself. But now in Mahayana, they add on not only the emptiness of the self in the 5 skandhas, form, consciousness, compositional factors, feelings, discrimination, but also it's the emptiness of other, so of all phenomena. So it just takes it a step further, which is, you can kind of see the parallel of staying with the individual, and now we're moving to more relational focus and analysis. And so that's the Zen tradition and other just great Mahayana sutras that go into these teachings, which emphasize what's called the ultimate view. And which is, I think, just incredibly beautiful. I mean, often when people do the Heart Sutra, they just feel so happy afterwards. And there's just something about it that's so powerful, because at some level you just know it's true. And the blessings are all there. But then there was a third turning, and the Buddha was you have to say, he was brilliant, is how I see it. Number one, he lived a very long time. You know, I mean, I personally love Jesus as well. I think he was wonderful and great and so compassionate and kind. But Jesus did not teach as long as the Buddha taught. The Buddha taught much, much longer. And so as a result, you do have a kind of just a wider range of teachings as a result, because he encountered so many more types of beings during all those years he lived. And so it's vast. So in the third turning, you basically have now a way of discriminating, of finding the middle way between the first two turnings, finding the balance. Because in the risk of the first turning is that one can become too literal with the different rules and understandings. And the problem that can happen with the second turning is that one can err towards nihilism. This can often happen when people first hear the teachings on emptiness. So the third turning is where there's discrimination of how to accurately apply these teachings for different individuals and different situations and times in one's life. And finding the true middle way, which is the core concept of Buddhism, of finding the middle place where there's neither permanence nor nihilism, but one's in the middle. That's the goal. Okay. Now, another really important distinction of what's common to all Buddhist practice is what's called the Four Seals. So I'll go through these. The first is whatever is composite is impermanent. So, I mean, everyone's heard so much about how Buddhism talks about impermanence. So that's what it's referring to, that anything that's composite means that it's composed of parts is going to be impermanent. Second, everything that is impure is suffering. So, you know, you see it's kind of interesting how the distinctions they're making here, that there is something that's not suffering, and that's purity, and then they go to great lengths to describe what that is. The third seal is all phenomena are empty and without a self. And by without a self, they mean there's no ultimate fixed identity, something that you can ultimately grab onto. It's very much, you know, in accord with quantum mechanics, which is part of what makes Buddhism so cool, that they figured all this out long time ago. And the fourth seal is that liberation, nirvana, is peace, free of suffering. Just to mention two books, if anyone's interested. We did classes on this one at Jefferson Tibetan Society for years. The World of Tibetan Buddhism by His Holiness the Dalai Lama is really a wonderful one on an overview of the philosophy and practices. And this one, What Makes You Not a Buddhist by Sangsar Jamyang Khyentse, is quite excellent. And it gets in more detail on the Four Seals. Okay. So just in terms of talking a little bit about Lama Tashi and his background, I was very fortunate to meet him back in like 1992 when I was helping to organize sacred music, sacred dance tours. And I had spent 1 month at his monastery in southern India, Dripung Losling Monastery, back in 1980 with my teacher, Geshe Tardo. And actually met Khensur Yeshe Thupten then, who was our first teacher at Jefferson Tibetan Society. But that's Lama Tashi's monastery as well. So it's a beautiful connection going back to then. And he's a wonderful practitioner. Like Jeanne mentioned, his multiphonic chanting is phenomenal. He was the Umze, the lead chant master of Dripung Losling Monastery, which is one of the largest Buddhist monasteries in the world, relocated in southern India. And he has the Geshe degree, which is the equivalent of postdoctorate training, very rigorous philosophical training. Many people have seen the debate that the monks do, and it's very active. And he's also just a great practitioner. I mean, he taught Buddhist philosophy and was the director of the Himalayan culture in India for 15 years. But in addition, he's just a great practitioner. My friendship, I was very fortunate that one of the people that helped with our organization for many years became close friends with Tashi because my friend was a musician, and he lives up in Orange, Lyle Sanford. And so he would bring Tashi back as much as he could. He liked Tashi like a brother. He grew up on a farm, and he was always frustrated that he couldn't connect with his brother who was a farmer. And then he met Lama Tashi on the tour, and he's like, it was just like a brother bond. So for many, many years, he brought Lama Tashi here, and he would do events for JTS. But he wasn't available to come after our teacher died because he had commitments in India that his teacher had asked him to do. But we had a wonderful opportunity, and I guess it was like, 1999, where we brought the head of the Gelugpa tradition, which is the main tradition of the Dalai Lama, and we brought him to Charlottesville, and he gave some special empowerments, and Lama Tashi and I were able to deepen our connection during that time when those empowerments were given, and then reconnect on that a few years ago. But now he's available, and he's here to teach for us, and I'm so happy that he's going to be coming here to share practices with all of you here at IMCC. So the basis of Vajrayana practice is the Mahayana view of not being able to tolerate the suffering of others. And you have mind training practices, Lojong practices for taking on suffering of others and giving them happiness. But then in addition, you have Vajrayana practices. And these Vajrayana practices are believed to be the fastest path to enlightenment. And the reason is because they're very extensive. They involve mantra. This is where mantra comes in. It's all connected to Vajrayana practices and visualization practices of various deities. And so just one of the unique aspects of Tibetan Buddhism is that you have a vast array of these unbroken lineages of these meditation practices that have been passed down from teacher to student over just an incredible period of time, these unbroken lineages. And that's one of the things that impressed me so much, that they did have these unbroken lineages. We have some Cistercian contemplative practices still in the Catholic tradition, but we just don't have the extent of these long unbroken practices. And just very quickly so we have time for some discussion. So next week, Lama Tashi will be sharing a complete practice of the 7 perfect practices, it's called, and it will include a mantra recitation of Om Ahum for purification. And ultimately, the Vajrayana practices are working with purifying not only our karma of body, speech, and mind, but also of our subtle body. And so this is where you get into chakras and channels and winds and drops, and there's a whole incredible sophisticated technology. And so that's what he'll be sharing, and that's part of some of the other programs he's offering while he's here in Charlottesville. So I guess we'll stop there. Thank you. So in Mahayana Buddhism, we dedicate the merit. And the reason is because it's believed that virtue is accumulated anytime you do any meditation practice, any kind of Dharma study, Dharma gathering, Dharma reflection. And that if you dedicate the merit, that will help to go towards the highest good. So that's the reason that it's done. There's a lot of reasoning that goes with a lot of these traditions. So I'll do it one time in Tibetan and one time in English. And if we can all just think of how we're dedicating this merit to help all the suffering in our world and to relieve the suffering and to quickly bring an end to the wars that are going on and all the violence that's going on in our world. Gewa di nordu dak, Lama sangye drupyorne, Drowa chikyang malupa, Dei sala goparsho, Jangchup semchok rinpoche, Make panam ke gyorjik, Ke pa nampa me par yang, Gongne gongdu pelbar so. By means of these virtuous activities, may I quickly attain the most exalted state of Buddhahood, and thereby may every sentient being, without a single exception, be established by me in that very state. The precious and sublime altruistic attitude of the Bodhisattva. To the extent that I have not cultivated it, I will now do so. That which I have cultivated, I will not allow to falter, but I will continue to cultivate it more and more. Thank you so much, everyone.